Hi all. This I should not I should not touch my face, so don't do that. Don't touch your face. Wash your hands all the time. So we touch our faces 3,000 times a day. So let's be careful. I wash my hands, so I'm clean. But these sticks, we have to actually try to avoid them. I would like to use my second economic video to deal with three different things. One is to understand the supply chain and how the supply chain will be affected by the crisis. And in fact, there's an interesting aspect of the supply chain that part of the supply chain is foreign. In the US, the retailers and the firms might be domestic, but truly the factories and the suppliers of parts to those factories are foreign, and that implies that, how do we actually guarantee that the whole supply chain is effective? So I will advocate on that, to have a coordination worldwide, and I think it's happening kind of organically, but I think it's more important that there's more conversation about the fiscal side internationally. There has to be far more coordination. For the moment, it's understandable that every country is just thinking for themselves right now, but if we want to deal with a global supply chain, we have to think globally, and therefore the support has to be globally. Second aspect that I want to discuss is the relationship between the economic crisis and the medical crisis. It is the case that because we're slowing down medical crisis, which in other words we're trying to slow down the number of cases. The United States right now, where I'm recording this on Saturday, has about 20,000 cases and about 250 deaths on that tally. So we want to slow down that significantly. But it is the issue that when you slow down the medical crisis, the contagion of the crisis, we exacerbate the economic crisis. So I want to actually explain both of them carefully. And finally, I would like to address a little bit what are the things that we have to do at home to provide incentives for households to stay home. Kind of clarify some of the comments of the video that I did on the part number 1. So let's see first the supply chain. Let me now discuss issues of the supply chain. So let me start with a typical supply chain where we have retailers at the end. We have firms that are the ones that provide goods to those retailers, factories that are providing final goods to the firms, and then parts, for example, on smaller shops that produce the parts. What happens in the supply chain is that we have products that go from one to the other, and these products at the end of the day reach the consumer. What we want to do in this recession, in order to deal with the coronavirus, is that we want to slow down consumption. So the policy is, in the end, to lower consumption. And what it implies is that we will have a shock. There's a lower amount of sales on retailers. And that lower sales of retailers is going to be transmitted through the supply chain. And in fact, the way I tend to think about that is that the shock starts relatively small on the retailer and then gets bigger as we go back into the supply chain. And the reason why this becomes bigger as we go along is at first is they are the same shock as a size of the assets. So same shock as share of assets goes up. Second, as we go along in the supply chain, moving from retailers all the way to the small producers, small firms, we also have less ability to borrow. So, and therefore, so again, the same shock will just feel much bigger for a small shop than from multinationals, so the retailers. And there's a third reason, which is what you all did with the beer game, okay? So you probably remember how the initial shock is propagated in the supply chain and amplified by the orders. So if I lower, so in other words, if I lower the consumption by 10%, the retailer, because it has an overstock, tend to request minus 15 from the firms, that tend to request minus 20 to the factories that request minus 30 from the part suppliers. So at the end, if we don't have a good prediction about what is going to happen to the final demand, the initial shock is just propagated and amplified in the supply chain. How do we solve that? Is we need to provide support. So again, as we said before, we have institutions like the Fed and the Treasury, and both of them, what they have to do is provide support to everyone in this chain. What complicates the issue is that even though retail and firms are probably domestic, very likely the firms and the parts are international. So this part of the supply chain might not belong to the country. And therefore having coordination between different central bankers is crucial to make sure that we have a supply chain that is healthy and that in the end we will be able to supply all the goods and services that we need. The main message of the supply chain discussion is that we need a global coordination. We need to make sure that everyone in that channel is being supported, and that implies coordinating globally with fiscal and monetary policy support to all the firms and organizations that belong to that supply chain. The second topic that I would like to discuss today is the relationship between the economic and the medical crisis. So there's a very nice paper written, it's a short paper, it's almost like a commentary written by Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas that talks a little bit about the relationship between the economic and the medical crisis. So let's discuss that in the iPad now, which I think is simpler to explain there. What I want to do is to look at the relationship between the economic crisis and the healthcare crisis. So I'm going to have a relationship between the number of cases and also on the drop on GDP or demand. By the way, this is based on Vox that I read from Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas. He's a professor in Berkeley. We were classmates at MIT. And what I'm going to do is to kind of oversimplify what he did in his Vox. So let's first start studying what happens if we actually did no intervention whatsoever. If we have no single measure and we allow the virus to take place, what is going to happen is that, as we discussed in the video number 1, there will be an exponential increase in the number of cases, and that increase in the exponential number of cases is going to overwhelm the healthcare sector. So the idea is that there is a capacity in the healthcare sector. Let me put that longer. In fact, let me just wait. There's a capacity in the healthcare sector, and all those individuals that, on all those cases that are above that capacity of the healthcare sector will not receive the proper attention, and there will be, unnecessary death that is going to happen to those individuals. Now, the virus is going to have a cost. It's going to have a cost in the economy in the sense that there will be a drop in the GDP. Now, the drop in the GDP, there's a part of the drop that is transitory because it's dealing with the sickness and the disease, but some part of the drop will be permanent, and the reason is that there will be death and there will be a reduction on the capacity to produce in the country. So the GDP will tend to go down and then up a little bit, but they will stabilize, and it will stabilize at a point that is smaller. So there's a drop on GDP, and of course the more dead individuals, the lower that GDP. So there's a gap that will exist at the end. Now,
what if we actually do something to stop the contagion? Well, I'm going to exaggerate here, but the point I want to do is to make the two curves to look very different. But imagine that we slow down the contagion, and the way we're doing that is we're asking and requesting people to stay home. So from the medical point of view, what we're going to do is to follow the red line, and the key point from the healthcare point of view is that the red line never reaches the capacity of the healthcare sector. So there is a gap that will exist between these two lines here, and that's the gap that implies that no unnecessary dead. Okay, now the problem is that we're asking people to stay home, and that has an impact on the GDP and the demand of the country. So truly what is going to happen is that the demand drop is going to be much bigger, and it's going to be much longer, because the spread of the disease goes a long time. And therefore, what is going to happen here is it's not only going to be deeper and longer, but at the end, it's going to be a smaller drop of the GDP. But in the short run, what is going to happen is that red line implies a much bigger and longer recession. It's transitory, which means that we can do something about it, but it's much bigger than expected.
So the main message of this section is that indeed there is a trade-off between the way we're dealing with the economic crisis and the way we're dealing with the medical crisis. I think the world is actually picking correctly. We're picking on the side of saving lives, and I'm really proud that we are actually making that choice. The economic cost is going to be extraordinarily large. And in fact, I think that everybody has agreed that it is okay to have a massive slowdown. Some of this slowdown will be transitory because people are going to delay their purchases, but some of this slowdown is actually economic losses, that are permanent economic losses. So we are choosing, I think, correctly, but that means that we have to be prepared to handle that tremendous slowdown. And a key part of that slowdown is what are we going to do with households that are suffering excessively from that crisis? What are we going to do with the workers that are losing their jobs? What are we going to do with the workers whose salaries depend also on hourly work? So it's not only the ones that are going to lose their jobs, the ones that are going to lose income because we will have slowdown in general of the economy, therefore they will be working less hours.